This is BBC One Scotland, now the BBC News and Reporting Scotland with Hugh Edwards and Sally McNair. It's 10 o'clock.
The BBC loses its Director General in the wake of the Hutton Report. Greg Dyke's resignation prompts mass protest by BBC staff. He explained his position had been compromised.
My sole aim as Director General of the BBC has been to defend our editorial independence and to act in the public interest.
I fully respect the independence of the BBC. I've got no doubt that the BBC will continue as it should do, to probe and question the government in every proper way.
The Prime Minister accepts the BBC's unreserved apology and wants to draw a line under the Kelly affair. Also tonight, leading shareholders probe several transfer deals at United. In Jerusalem, at least 10 are killed by Palestinian bombers. And the weather causes problems on the roads, the railways and at the airports.
And here in Scotland, 3 arrests hours after Scotland's first cannabis cafe opens in Edinburgh. And a man died in custody after he was found drunk. A sheriff says the police acted unprofessionally.
Good evening. Greg Dyke has left the BBC. He said his position as Director General had been compromised by Lord Hutton's criticism of the BBC's management. Moments after he resigned, the BBC apologised unreservedly for any errors it had made. Mr Dyke's statement was greeted with dismay and anger among BBC staff across Britain. Tonight, Mr Dyke insisted he did not necessarily accept Lord Hutton's findings, and he said he did not know what the BBC had apologised for. Gavin Hewitt reports now on the day's events.
This has been one of the most turbulent days in the BBC's history, with staff from all over the corporation walking out and protesting at the resignation of Greg Dyke. When he returned to Television Centre, he was mobbed. Some staff were concerned that in owning up to serious mistakes, the BBC might compromise its independence. And Greg Dyke addressed this when he climbed on a table in the BBC's newsroom.
Do not be cowed. Do not be over-pressurised. Make sure we're right. Be fair. But don't let anyone pressurise you.
This extraordinary day for the BBC, Downing Street, it was made clear the Prime Minister was still waiting for a full apology from the corporation. A mile away, the BBC governors were meeting again, aware the resignation of the chairman had not settled the crisis. Greg Dyke offered to step down too, because he felt he did not have the full support of the governors. He also felt that his departure was the only way to resolve this whole affair. And early afternoon, he left Broadcasting House.
With the departure of Gavin and myself, and the apology I issued on behalf of the BBC yesterday, I hope that a line can now be drawn under this whole episode.
Shortly after, Richard Ryder, the acting chairman of the Board of Governors, gave the apology the government wanted.
On behalf of the BBC, I have no hesitation in apologising unreservedly for our errors and to the individuals whose reputations were affected by them.
Moments later, the Prime Minister said this apology was all he was ever seeking and hinted that the bitter row at the BBC that led to the death of David Kelly was over.
I welcome very much the statement that the governors have made, and just should say this for me has always been a very simple matter of an accusation that was a very serious one that was made, that was a false accusation as Lord Hutton has found, and it's now been withdrawn. That's all I ever wanted, and I want to make it absolutely clear to you, I fully respect the independence of the BBC.
But almost immediately there were concerns both within the BBC and outside that the corporation's apology might be seen as bending the knee to government. Later, Greg Dyke indicated that he too had his doubts.
I couldn't quite work out what they'd apologised for.
He also gave his verdict on the Hutton Report.
I'm not going to talk about Hutton now, but I will talk about it at some stage, but I don't necessarily accept the findings of Lord Hutton.
The new man who will take charge at the corporation for the time being is Mark Byford, a trusted and long-serving BBC director. He began by talking of the standards the BBC must achieve.
The BBC must provide high-quality, independent, impartial journalism, recognised for its accuracy, fairness and objectivity.
Tonight he came to the BBC newsroom and stood shoulder to shoulder with Richard Sambrook, the Director of News, one of those whose future was also in doubt. As for Andrew Gilligan, there will be further discussions. Tonight, this is a troubled, bruised organisation. Most people here accept that serious errors were made. But there are real concerns that in responding to Lord Hutton's criticism, the BBC doesn't give the impression of raising a white flag. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News.
It's 4 years to the day since Greg Dyke took over at the BBC, succeeding John Burt. He set about instilling a new sense of dynamism and self-confidence among BBC staff, and his no-nonsense management approach proved very popular. James Robbins reports on the Dyke era.
Hi, how are you? What do you want, guys?
Greg Dyke's first day at the BBC. Jokey, informal, never a conventional Director General. He won over most staff very quickly, lifting low morale, cutting bureaucracy.
Hello. For those who I haven't met, I'm Greg Dyke. Everybody calls me Greg. I hope you will.
Just imagine.
Greg Dyke encouraged creativity and risk-taking. He promised to cut the crap and poured money into programmes instead.
So the ideas for making the BBC a better place have come from you.
Sport was one winner, extra money to buy serious football again. BBC audiences grew, but Greg Dyke had critics accusing him of chasing ratings.
I think that Greg's instinct is to be highly competitive. I'm on record as criticising that. I think that sometimes Greg felt that he was in competition with organisations that in fact he wasn't in competition with. The core role of the BBC is to perform a particular function within our broadcasting ecology.
And Greg Dyke's path to the BBC was certainly commercial. At TVAM he promoted Roland Rat and bingo numbers.
Good morning, beloved Rat fans. Yeah.
Audiences tripled in a year. Even Greg Dyke thought he was not BBC material.
You know, there's one or two interesting jobs at the BBC, but I'm not sure they'd offer them to me. So. How are you?
But they did offer him the top job, and by the time Greg Dyke arrived, he was a rich man, a big donor to the Labour Party. So his appointment at the BBC was hugely controversial. Dubbed Tony's crony, some say his determination to prove he was no government stooge brought his own downfall.
It's hard not to imagine, once this war with the government occurred, and his past, that it would cloud his judgment to the extent that he felt, gosh, I need to show that I'm independent here and stand my ground.
And stand it he did. But Lord Hutton blamed Greg Dyke for failing to ensure proper editorial checks were in place, failing to investigate properly the government's complaints. Today, many BBC staff have been demonstrating their support for Greg Dyke around Britain. The man who appointed him is impressed.
The extent of those demonstrations show that really, not to put too fine a point on it, he was loved by the BBC. And that's a pretty hard organisation to be loved by. So he's left quite a legacy.
A complex legacy, no doubt about it. A BBC which was confident and now feels confused, facing a future without Greg Dyke under interim leadership. James Robbins, BBC News.
Let's talk to our media correspondent, Nick.